Funny how competition works. At first, they were watching you like you were the problem, measuring your moves, comparing your progress, trying to figure out why you weren't breaking under the same pressure that made them uncomfortable. But the moment they decided to compete with you, something ugly happened. They didn't discover your weakness. They discovered their own. Every comparison became a mirror. Every time you stayed calm, they got louder. Every time you kept moving, they started questioning themselves. And now the tension isn't even really about you anymore. It's about what your existence forces them to admit about themselves. They're arguing, blaming, turning on each other, because competing with someone who doesn't need to prove anything is a brutal way to expose how badly you need validation. You didn't have to attack them. You didn't have to humiliate them. You didn't even have to say a word. You simply kept becoming harder to ignore, and suddenly all those people who looked united when they were judging you started falling apart when they had to measure themselves against you. And that's where things get interesting, because insecurity has a strange habit of becoming anger when someone refuses to shrink for your comfort. There's something people never tell you about being noticed. They think attention is about admiration, jealousy, praise, or hate. It isn't. Sometimes attention is just discomfort wearing a different face. You walk into a room, you keep your mouth shut, you handle your business, and suddenly somebody who was perfectly comfortable with themselves starts acting strange. Interesting, isn't it? You didn't insult them. You didn't challenge them. You didn't even ask them to compete. Yet somehow your existence became a problem they needed to solve. That's because your presence can expose things people worked very hard to hide from themselves. They see your discipline and remember every promise they broke. They see your confidence and remember every time they needed approval. They see you moving quietly and realize how much noise they make just to convince everyone they're moving too. That's when the mirror becomes uncomfortable. You're not showing them who they could be. You're showing them what they've been avoiding. And people can tolerate almost anything except being confronted with themselves. So they start comparing your progress against their progress, your calm against their chaos, your patience against their impatience, your results against their excuses. At first, they call it motivation. Then they call it competition. Then, somewhere along the way, competition turns into obsession because they stop asking, "How can I improve?" and start asking, "Why is that person ahead of me?" That question changes everything. Improvement requires honesty. Envy requires someone else to blame. And blaming you is much easier than admitting they haven't been consistent. So suddenly every little thing you do becomes evidence. You post something, they analyze it. You disappear, they wonder what you're planning. You succeed, they explain why it doesn't count. You fail, they celebrate like they just won a championship. Imagine spending that much energy trying to prove somebody else isn't impressive. That's not confidence. That's insecurity with a costume on. And the funniest part is that you may not even realize how much you're exposing simply by staying focused. You don't need to announce your goals anymore. You don't need to explain every move. You don't need to convince anybody that you're changing. Your habits do the talking. Your discipline does the talking. The way you stop reacting to every little provocation does the talking. People who once understood how to push your buttons suddenly discover the buttons don't work anymore. Now they have to sit with themselves. That silence can be terrifying for someone who only feels powerful when they can control your reaction. They expected you to argue. You stayed quiet. They expected you to defend yourself. You kept working. They expected you to chase their approval. You stopped looking in their direction. And without realizing it, you took away the stage they were using to perform their superiority. That's when the mirror gets even sharper. Because the more you improve, the harder it becomes for them to maintain the story they created about you. Maybe they told themselves you were lucky. Maybe they said you wouldn't last. Maybe they convinced themselves that your confidence was arrogance and your privacy was weakness. But every time you keep going, that story starts cracking. And instead of updating their opinion, some people double down. They become louder, more critical, more competitive, more desperate to find something wrong with you. because admitting that you simply stayed consistent would force them to look at their own inconsistency. They don't hate the person you are. Sometimes they hate the evidence you represent. You are evidence that excuses aren't always necessary. You are evidence that silence can be stronger than attention. You are evidence that somebody can walk away from the crowd and still move forward without begging the crowd to understand. And once that realization starts spreading through their minds, the competition stops being about winning against you and starts becoming a private argument with everything they thought they were capable of. People love competition when they think they're going to win. They enjoy the little game, the comparisons, the subtle flexes, the quiet measuring of who has more, who moves faster, who gets noticed first. Everyone smiles when they believe they're ahead. But the moment competition stops feeding their ego and starts exposing their weaknesses, the smile changes. Suddenly, the game isn't fun anymore. Suddenly, you're arrogant, you're lucky, you're getting too much attention. Funny how quickly confidence becomes an accusation when someone else refuses to stay beneath you. They thought competing with you would reveal your limitations, but instead it revealed theirs. Every move you made became another uncomfortable reminder that they weren't as disciplined as they claimed, weren't as patient as they pretended, and weren't as secure as their confidence suggested. That's the strange thing about insecurity. It rarely introduces itself honestly. It doesn't walk into the room and say, "I'm afraid I'm not good enough." No, it dresses itself up. Sometimes it looks like arrogance. Sometimes it sounds like criticism. Sometimes it hides behind jokes, sarcasm, constant comparison, or an endless need to prove superiority. A person can spend hours explaining why you aren't impressive while secretly being terrified that you actually are. They'll pick apart your decisions because examining their own would be too uncomfortable. They'll focus on your mistakes because your progress makes theirs harder to ignore. They'll search for reasons your success doesn't count, because accepting it would force them to ask the question they've been avoiding. Why am I not where I want to be? And that question can destroy a fragile ego. Because once someone starts measuring their life against yours, they stop living their own life. They wake up checking where you are. They notice what you're doing. They calculate your progress. They compare your confidence to theirs. They look at your discipline and wonder how you maintain it. They see you becoming quieter and somehow become louder. You're not even participating in the competition anymore, yet somehow they're still racing. That's when you know the competition was never really between two people. It was between who they believed they were and who your progress reminded them they could have become. You don't need to defeat insecure people. That's the trap. If you spend all your energy proving them wrong, you've accepted their invitation into a game designed to distract you. Let them compare. Let them speculate. Let them create their little scoreboard. Your job is to keep building. Because the most powerful response to someone questioning your worth isn't an argument. It's consistency. You don't need to announce every victory. You don't need to throw success in anyone's face. You simply continue until the results become too obvious to debate. That kind of progress irritates people who survive on excuses because results don't care about excuses. And when your results begin speaking louder than your explanations, something fascinating happens. The people who were competing with you start competing with each other. One person says you're overrated. Another says you're lucky. Another says they could do what you're doing if they really wanted to. Then somebody quietly notices that all of them have been talking while you've been working. Suddenly, the group that thought they were united against you begins turning inward. Who is doing better? Who is falling behind? Who gets more attention? Who has more discipline? Who actually has the courage to change? The same competition they created around you begins eating away at them because insecurity doesn't know when to stop. It keeps demanding another comparison, another victory, another person to defeat, until eventually the person they're fighting hardest is the person staring back at them in the mirror, and you keep moving. Not because you're better than them, but because you finally understand something they haven't learned yet: your life becomes miserable the moment you need everyone else to lose before you can feel like you're winning. And once you stop needing that kind of validation, you become very difficult to control, because you no longer need to participate in their little psychological circus just to feel powerful. It starts quietly. A glance that lasts a little too long. A joke that doesn't really sound like a joke. A compliment with something sharp hiding underneath it. Nobody announces, "I'm comparing myself to you." That would be too honest. Instead, comparison sneaks in through little comments, little reactions, little changes in behavior. They notice your progress, then they look at theirs. They notice your confidence, then suddenly they need to prove they have more. They see you staying calm while everyone else is reacting, and somehow your silence becomes an insult they feel personally. Strange, isn't it? You can be doing absolutely nothing to them, and still become the person they measure themselves against every single day. You become the scoreboard they never agreed to but can't stop checking. At first, they think the solution is simple. Beat you, outperform you, get ahead of you. Make sure everyone notices them before anyone notices you. It sounds harmless when they call it ambition. But there's a difference between wanting to improve and needing someone else to lose. One builds you, the other consumes you. And once they cross that line, they stop paying attention to their own path. Every decision becomes a reaction to yours. If you move forward, they speed up. If you stay quiet, they start talking. If you disappear, they start wondering what you're doing. If you succeed, they need an explanation. They aren't building anymore. They're chasing a reflection. And that's where things get interesting. Because when several insecure people gather around the same target, they rarely stay united for long. Why? Because insecurity doesn't know how to share the spotlight. Everyone wants to be the strongest, smartest, most successful person in the room. And when you become the standard they're all comparing themselves against, they eventually start comparing themselves against each other. One person thinks another is getting too much attention. Someone else thinks another isn't working hard enough. Suddenly, the same people who were laughing together about you are whispering about each other. The alliance starts cracking because nobody actually joined the competition to build something. They joined because they wanted proof that they were superior. Meanwhile, you might be completely unaware of the drama. You're working, learning, improving, fixing your mistakes, protecting your peace. You don't realize that your silence is creating more noise in their minds than any speech ever could. That's the power of not participating. When you refuse to react, people are forced to create their own explanations. And insecure minds are incredibly creative when they don't have access to the truth. They fill the empty space with assumptions. They think they're better. They're trying to show off. They must be getting lucky. They probably won't last. Anything sounds better than admitting, maybe they're simply more consistent than I am. The funniest part is that you never asked to be their standard. You never volunteered to become the person they measure themselves against. They chose that role for you because something about your progress bothered a part of them they hadn't confronted yet. Maybe your discipline reminds them of their excuses. Maybe your independence reminds them of how dependent they are on approval. Maybe your ability to walk away reminds them how badly they need to be accepted. You become a mirror without trying, and mirrors don't care whether you like the reflection. So let them compare. Let them argue over who is ahead. Let them turn every little achievement into a contest. You don't have to interrupt the process. Sometimes the smartest move is simply refusing to enter the room where everyone is fighting for validation. Because while they're busy calculating who deserves the spotlight, you can be building something that doesn't require an audience. While they're trying to beat your last achievement, you're already focused on your next one. While they're explaining why you don't deserve the attention, you're becoming less dependent on attention altogether. And eventually, that becomes the part they can't understand. They expected competition to make you defensive. Instead, it made you detached. They expected you to fight for your position. Instead, you kept improving. They expected you to chase their approval. Instead, you stopped looking for it. Now the competition has nowhere to go because you're not playing. And when the person everyone was trying to defeat refuses to pick up the weapon, the competitors eventually turn around and realize they've been fighting each other the entire time, while the person they were watching has already walked far beyond the noise and into a life they can't reach by arguing about it. Silence is a strange weapon because it doesn't look like one. People understand shouting, they understand arguments, they understand insults, explanations, and dramatic reactions. Those things give them something to fight against. But silence leaves them alone with their own imagination, and that can be far more uncomfortable. When you stopped reacting to every little comment, every little provocation, every attempt to pull you into their drama, something changed. They couldn't read you anymore. They couldn't predict what you were thinking. They couldn't tell whether you were angry, amused, disappointed, or simply uninterested. And when people lose access to your reaction, they often start creating their own version of reality. Suddenly your silence means arrogance. Then it means weakness. Then it means you're hiding something. Funny how one quiet person can make an entire room invent explanations just to feel comfortable again. They wanted a reaction because a reaction gives them control. If they could make you angry, they could point at your anger. If they could make you defensive, they could accuse you of insecurity. If they could make you explain yourself, they could interrupt your explanation and twist it into something else. It's an old little game. Push someone, watch them react, then use their reaction as proof that they deserve to push them in the first place. But you stopped playing. You learned that not every accusation deserves an answer, and not every opinion deserves your attention. You started realizing that some people aren't asking questions because they want answers. They're asking because they want access to you. They want your energy. They want to know they can still move you with a few words. And when they discovered they couldn't, their behavior became louder. That's the irony. The quieter you became, the more they needed to talk. The less you explained, the more stories appeared. The less you defended yourself, the more aggressively they tried to define you. They needed you to participate because without your participation, their little performance started looking ridiculous. Imagine throwing punches at someone who simply refuses to fight back. Eventually, everyone watching starts wondering who the real aggressor is. That's what happens when you stop feeding unnecessary conflict. You don't have to expose anyone. Their reactions expose them for you. Your silence also removes the emotional reward they were expecting. Some people provoke because they want to feel powerful. They want to see your face change. They want to watch you lose your patience. They want that little moment where they can say, "See, I got to them." But when nothing happens, the satisfaction disappears. They throw the bait into the water and nothing bites. They try again. Still nothing. They become more dramatic. Still nothing. Eventually, frustration takes over because they realize the person they wanted to control has become emotionally unavailable to the game. That doesn't mean you become cold or cruel. It means you become selective. You learn that peace is not something you receive from other people. It's something you protect through your choices. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop proving your intentions to people determined to question them. You stop announcing your next move to people who only care because they want to compete with it. You start understanding that privacy isn't weakness. Sometimes privacy is simply intelligence. Not everyone deserves a front row seat to your plans, your struggles, your failures, or your victories. And that's when your silence becomes powerful without you trying to make it powerful. You aren't using it to punish anybody. You aren't trying to look mysterious. You simply have better things to do. While they're wondering why you aren't responding, you're solving problems. While they're discussing your absence, you're building. While they're waiting for you to react, you're becoming someone who doesn't need to react. That difference creates an uncomfortable contrast. They can't understand why their noise isn't changing your direction. They can't understand why you don't seem desperate to correct every misunderstanding. They can't understand why you're willing to let people think whatever they want. Because eventually you realize something: people who truly know your value don't need constant explanations, and people determined to undervalue you won't be convinced by one anyway. So you let them talk, let them speculate, let them compete, let them turn your silence into whatever story helps them sleep at night. You don't have to correct every story, because every time you respond to someone else's insecurity, you give them another piece of your attention. And attention is expensive. You only have so much of it. Spend it carefully. Spend it on your growth, your discipline, your work, your future. Let them keep screaming into an empty room while you quietly become the kind of person whose results eventually make all that noise look exactly like what it was: desperation, looking for an audience and finding none. Some people don't actually want to become better. They just want to feel better than somebody else. There's a difference, and it becomes obvious the moment competition enters the room. They see you progressing, and suddenly their own progress doesn't feel satisfying anymore. So they decide they need to beat you, not because you did something to them, not because you challenged them, but because somewhere inside, they attach their self-worth to being ahead of somebody else. That's when the game becomes dangerous for them, because if your failure is the only thing making them feel successful, then your success becomes a personal threat. And you didn't even know you were playing. They start keeping score: who moved first, who got noticed first, who achieved more, who received more praise, who looked more confident, who had the better opportunity. Every little detail becomes another measurement. And at first, they probably convince themselves it's healthy competition. They tell themselves they're motivated by you. Maybe they even smile and say, "You inspire me." But there's a difference between inspiration and obsession. Inspiration makes you work harder on yourself. Obsession makes you watch someone else harder than you watch yourself. Suddenly, they know what you're doing better than they know what they need to improve. That's where the insecurity begins leaking through the cracks. They don't ask, "What can I learn from this?" They ask, "How can I make this person look smaller?" They search for flaws because flaws make them feel safer. They minimize your achievements because acknowledging them would make their own excuses uncomfortable. They tell themselves your success was luck, timing, connections, circumstances, anything that allows them to avoid the possibility that you simply stayed consistent while they kept negotiating with themselves. Because admitting that would hurt. It would mean the enemy was never you. The obstacle was always the version of themselves they refused to discipline. And the funniest part is that you don't have to defeat them. They begin defeating themselves the moment they make you their measurement. Every hour they spend thinking about your progress is an hour they aren't spending on theirs. Every emotional reaction to your success becomes another distraction. Every attempt to prove they're better becomes another reminder that they need your existence to feel important. Imagine building your entire identity around someone you claim you don't care about. That's not strength. That's dependency wearing expensive clothing. You can see it in the way they react when you win. A secure person can watch somebody succeed without feeling personally attacked. An insecure person needs to explain the victory away. They had help. It wasn't that difficult. I could do that too. Notice the pattern. They never celebrate. They calculate. They don't appreciate. They compare. They don't ask how you did it. They ask why you deserve it. Because your achievement isn't just an achievement anymore. In their mind, it's a statement about them. If you're moving forward, they interpret it as evidence that they're standing still. But your journey was never a courtroom. You don't need to prove that you deserve your progress to people who have already decided they dislike the evidence. Keep working. Keep learning. Keep making mistakes. Keep improving. Let your discipline become boring. That's what makes it powerful. You don't need dramatic moments every week. You need ordinary days where you do what you said you would do even when nobody is watching. That kind of consistency is difficult for insecure people to compete with. Because there is nothing dramatic to attack. You aren't giving them scandals. You aren't giving them arguments. You're giving them results. Eventually, they may realize something uncomfortable. Beating you would never have made them whole. Even if they passed you, there would always be another person to compare themselves with, another achievement to chase, another person to defeat. Because when self-worth depends on superiority, there is never enough. Somebody always has more. Somebody always moves faster. Somebody always gets more attention. The race never ends because the finish line is imaginary. And while they're running toward an identity built on comparison, you can step outside the race entirely and decide that your only real competition is the person you were yesterday. That's when the whole thing changes. You stop needing to be ahead. You start needing to be better than your excuses. You stop needing applause. You start needing discipline. You stop asking who is watching. You start asking whether you're doing the work. And suddenly the person they were trying so desperately to defeat is no longer interested in defeating anyone. You become harder to provoke because you have nothing to prove. You become harder to manipulate because you no longer need their approval. You become harder to distract because your attention belongs to your future, not their insecurity. And that is the moment they discover the most frustrating truth of all. They could spend years trying to beat you and still lose the moment you stop measuring your worth against them. There comes a point where you stop noticing the noise because you become too busy building. At first you hear everything: the comments, the comparisons, the little jokes disguised as compliments, the people trying to figure out whether you're really changing or just pretending. You notice who suddenly becomes distant when you start improving. You notice who becomes strangely competitive when your life begins moving forward. But eventually something changes inside you. You realize none of it deserves your attention. Let them compete. Let them compare. Let them create their imaginary scoreboard. You have something better to do. You have a life to build. And there is something almost amusing about watching people destroy their peace trying to compete with someone who isn't competing with them. They thought your progress would pull you into the same game they were playing. They expected you to respond to every challenge, defend every achievement, explain every decision, and prove that you deserved the position you earned. But you stopped giving them that satisfaction. You started understanding that not every challenge deserves an answer. Sometimes the strongest response is simply continuing. Keep waking up, keep working, keep learning, keep improving. Keep showing up when nobody is impressed. That kind of discipline looks boring from the outside, but it becomes terrifyingly effective over time, because while everyone else is waiting for some dramatic moment, you're quietly stacking ordinary days together until those days become a completely different life. And while you're building, they're spending energy watching. That's the part people rarely understand. You don't have to attack someone to create distance between yourself and them. Sometimes all you have to do is remain consistent. Your consistency becomes a contrast. Your calm becomes a contrast. Your ability to move without constant validation becomes a contrast. They start noticing things they didn't want to notice. You're still moving even when nobody is praising you. You're still improving even after setbacks. You're still focused even when people misunderstand you. Meanwhile, they're spending hours discussing what you're doing, why you're doing it, and whether you deserve it. They call it curiosity. They call it competition. But deep down, they know they're distracted, and distraction has a price. Every minute spent monitoring someone else is a minute taken away from your own development. Every emotional reaction to another person's success becomes energy you could have invested in your own life. Every argument about who is better becomes another opportunity to avoid the uncomfortable question of whether you're actually becoming better. That's how competition slowly turns into collapse, not because someone defeated them, but because they became so obsessed with the race that they forgot to build anything worth winning. You don't need to celebrate their mistakes. You don't need to laugh when they struggle. You don't need revenge. Revenge keeps you connected to people you already outgrew. Let consequences handle what you don't need to handle. If someone spends their life comparing themselves to you, that's their burden. If they constantly need to prove they're better, that's their burden. If they turn every achievement into a competition, that's their burden. You don't have to carry it for them. Your responsibility is your own mind, your own habits, your own direction. The beautiful part is that growth changes what you consider important. Things that once triggered you start looking ridiculous. The need to respond disappears. The need to explain yourself disappears. The need to be recognized disappears. You begin protecting your attention like it actually matters because you finally understand that it does. Your attention is where your life goes. Give it to drama and your life becomes drama. Give it to comparison and your life becomes comparison. Give it to discipline and slowly your life begins reflecting discipline. Give it to your purpose, and eventually your environment starts changing because you are no longer available for every distraction that knocks on the door. So while they're arguing over who is ahead, you're asking whether you're becoming who you said you would become. While they're trying to prove you wrong, you're correcting your weaknesses. While they're waiting for your next move, you're preparing for the move after that. While they're trying to make you react, you're learning how to remain calm. They thought your silence meant you had nothing to say. They didn't understand that sometimes silence means you finally realized words are too expensive to waste on people committed to misunderstanding you. And eventually, the competition becomes almost invisible because you've moved beyond it. They can still compare. They can still speculate. They can still create stories about your success. None of it changes your direction. You've learned the secret they never wanted you to learn. You don't become powerful by making everyone else feel small. You become powerful by becoming so focused on your own growth that other people's opinions lose their ability to control your emotions. And when that happens, the people who once thought they were competing with you may still be running, shouting, comparing, and trying to prove something, while you're somewhere completely different, building quietly, improving relentlessly, protecting your peace, and becoming so committed to your own future that their entire competition eventually looks like a game you never needed to play in the first place.